The marble felt cold beneath Eleanor Ashford's worn slippers as she ascended the grand staircase of Kensington Palace. Each step upward was a step deeper into judgment. Candlelight from 8 massive crystal chandeliers transformed the ballroom into a golden cathedral, beautiful and merciless. The light caught every thread of her pale ivory gown, illuminating the careful mending along the hem, the faded embroidery that had once been gold, the yellowed lace at her sleeves that spoke of a prosperity 5 years dead. She was 23 years old, and she was descending into hell wrapped in silk. "Oh, my dear heavens," a voice like cut glass sliced through the string quartet's melody. "Is that gown from the last century? How historically educational." Lady Vivian Hartley stood at the base of the stairs, a vision in crimson silk and diamonds. Her platinum blonde hair was arranged in elaborate curls that had required 3 servants and 2 hours. Her ice-blue eyes held all the warmth of a December lake, and her rosebud lips curved in a smile that promised cruelty, disguised as concern. Eleanor's fingers tightened on her dance card, empty and destined to remain so. She kept her chin lifted, her amber eyes steady, even as the laughter began to ripple through the crowd like poison spreading through water. She had learned, in the 3 years since her father's scandalous death and their financial ruin, that dignity was the only possession no one could steal from you. They could take your home, your gowns, your standing in society, but they couldn't take the straightness of your spine or the steadiness of your gaze, unless you let them. "Lady Vivian," Eleanor said, her voice quieter than she would have liked, but steady nonetheless. "How lovely to see you. And you, dear Eleanor." Vivian's fan, trimmed in gold and ostrich feathers, fluttered near her face. "Though I must say, your courage in appearing tonight is quite remarkable. After your family's— Well, we needn't speak of unpleasant things at a ball, need we?" The women surrounding Vivian, draped in emeralds and sapphires, their laughter high and sharp as breaking glass, watched Eleanor the way cats watch a wounded bird, waiting, anticipating. Eleanor moved past them, each step across that polished marble floor an act of will. The ballroom stretched before her, impossibly vast. White and grey marble reflected the candlelight, turning the floor into a mirror that showed her own poverty with brutal honesty. Ivory damask wallpaper gleamed with gold fleur-de-lis patterns. Floor-to-ceiling windows, hung with midnight blue velvet curtains, overlooked the darkened gardens. Between the windows, enormous gilt-framed mirrors multiplied the splendor, and with it, the whispers. She found a corner near a column, half hidden by shadow, and pressed her back against the cool marble. From here she could observe without being the center of observation. Couples swirled across the floor in perfect waltzes, their silks and satins creating whirlpools of color, deep burgundies, rich emeralds, royal purples. The men in their military dress uniforms, all navy wool and gold braid, the women like exotic flowers cultivated and displayed. And then she saw him. Prince Alexander Charles Thornwick stood on the second-floor gallery, looking down at the ballroom with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. He was tall, commanding even from a distance, his dark hair swept back from a face of aristocratic angles, high cheekbones, strong jaw, a straight nose that spoke of generations of breeding. His royal military dress uniform fit him like it had been sewn onto his body, deep navy with gold epaulets that caught the light, medals across his chest, a ceremonial sword at his side. His steel blue eyes swept across the crowd below with an intensity that made her shiver. Next to him stood a woman who could only be his mother, the Duchess Margaret Thornwick, steel-grey hair arranged in an austere updo, emerald velvet gown dripping with diamonds, and a face that had forgotten how to soften. She was gesturing toward the ballroom floor, toward Lady Vivian, who had positioned herself in the center of the marble expanse like a crimson jewel waiting to be claimed. Eleanor looked away. She didn't belong in the same world as princes and crowns. She was here because refusing the invitation would have been a greater insult than attending, would have confirmed every cruel thing society whispered about the Ashfords. But she would endure the evening, keep her head high, and leave with whatever scraps of dignity she could salvage. She didn't know that on the gallery above, Prince Alexander's entire focus had narrowed to a young woman in a wine-stained ivory gown, standing alone by a marble column, watching the world with eyes that held both pain and an unbreakable strength. He didn't know that 3 years of searching were about to end. "There, Alexander." His mother's voice cut through his thoughts. "Lady Vivian. Beauty, breeding, wealth and connections to every major house in England. Everything a future queen requires. She's waiting for you to ask her to dance. The whole ballroom is waiting. It's expected." Alexander said nothing. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he watched Vivian laugh at something a young earl said, her hand touching his arm with calculated grace. She was beautiful, yes, perfect by every measure society valued, and completely empty. His eyes returned to the woman by the column. Dark chestnut hair, almost mahogany in the candlelight, arranged in a simple bun with tendrils escaping around her face. Pale skin with a natural flush on her cheeks. Amber eyes that were currently downcast, studying her worn gloves as if they held the secrets of the universe. Something about her pulled at his memory, the way she held herself, the quiet dignity in her posture, despite the obvious poverty of her dress. His breath stopped. The shape of her face, the small beauty mark above her right collarbone just visible above the neckline of her gown. 3 years ago. A dusty country road in late summer. His horse injured, himself disguised in common clothes to escape palace life for a few precious days, and a young woman in a simple day dress who stopped her carriage to help a stranger. "Your horse is favoring his left foreleg," she'd said, kneeling in the dust without hesitation, her hands gentle as she examined the injury. "It's not broken, thank God, but he needs rest and care." He'd been struck speechless. Noble ladies didn't kneel in the dirt for injured animals. They didn't tear strips from their own petticoats to bandage a stranger's horse. They didn't sit beside the road sharing their lunch, bread and cheese and early apples, talking about poetry and justice, and the absurdity of judging people by accidents of birth rather than content of character. "I think," she'd said, looking at him with those remarkable amber eyes, "that a person's worth has nothing to do with their station. It's about how they treat those who can offer them nothing in return." He'd wanted to tell her who he was, wanted to see if her kindness would survive the revelation, but his 2 borrowed days of freedom had ended, and duty had called him back to the palace. He'd searched for her, discreetly through trusted servants, but the countryside was vast and she'd never mentioned her name or estate. And now, here she was, in his palace, at a ball, wearing poverty like a crown and enduring cruelty with the same quiet grace she'd shown that wounded horse. Eleanor Ashford, he'd heard the name whispered as he descended from the gallery, daughter of the late Baron Ashford, whose financial scandal and sudden death had destroyed the family. She lived now on the charity of distant relatives, a ghost haunting the edges of society. "Alexander." His mother's hand on his arm brought him back to the present. "You're staring. It's unseemly." "I'm observing," he said quietly. "Then observe Lady Vivian. She's everything we've discussed. Eleanor Ashford is nothing. Less than nothing. A charity case in a mended gown. You cannot possibly be. I know exactly who she is." Alexander's voice was soft, but held an edge that made his mother's hand fall away. "And I know exactly what I'm going to do." Before the Duchess could respond, movement on the ballroom floor caught their attention. A young baron, Lord Philip Ashton, known for his cruel wit and his father's vast coal fortune, was approaching Eleanor. His friends clustered behind him, barely suppressing laughter. Alexander's hands gripped the gallery balustrade hard enough to hurt. Eleanor looked up in surprise as Lord Ashton bowed before her with exaggerated flourish. "Miss Ashford," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Might I have the honor of this dance?" Hope flickered across her face for just an instant before she mastered it. Yes, thank you, Lord Ashton." She extended her hand. He looked at it, looked at her worn gloves, then stepped back, his expression transforming into mock horror. "Oh, my sincerest apologies, Miss Ashford. I mistook you for one of the palace servants. How terribly awkward." He turned to his friends. "Honestly, in that gown, who could tell the difference?" The laughter that erupted was vicious. Eleanor's hand fell to her side. The hope that had lit her eyes for that brief moment died, replaced by something harder. But she didn't cry. didn't flee. She simply nodded once, as if confirming something she'd always known, and turned away. Alexander was already moving toward the stairs. "Alexander," his mother hissed, "where are you going?" He didn't answer. Lady Vivian had seen the exchange, had probably orchestrated it. Philip Ashton was one of her devoted admirers. Now she glided across the floor, her crimson skirts rustling, a glass of red wine in her hand. She'd dismissed a servant who'd been carrying a tray, insisting she'd deliver this particular glass herself. Eleanor had made it perhaps 10 steps when Vivian intercepted her. "Eleanor, darling," Vivian's voice dripped false sympathy, "I feel simply terrible about Lord Ashton's rudeness. Please, allow me to offer you some refreshment. You look quite flushed." Eleanor's eyes met Vivian's, and for a moment, understanding passed between them. Eleanor knew what was coming, Vivian knew she knew, and Vivian didn't care. "That's very kind of you, Lady Vivian, but I insist." Vivian extended the wine glass. Eleanor, trapped by the rules of polite society that still governed her, even when society itself had abandoned her, reached for the glass. Vivian's hand slipped. Red wine cascaded down the front of Eleanor's ivory gown, soaking into the already worn fabric, spreading like blood across her bodice and skirts. The gasp that went up from the ballroom was collective, sharp. Then came the laughter, waves of it, rolling across the marble floor, echoing off the high ceilings. "Oh!" Vivian's hand flew to her mouth, her ice-blue eyes wide with theatrical shock. "Oh, my dear Eleanor, I'm so terribly sorry. How clumsy of me. Your gown is simply ruined." Eleanor stood very still. Wine dripped from the soaked fabric, pooling at her feet, dark against the white marble. In the mirrors on the walls, her reflection was multiplied a dozen times. A woman drenched in wine and humiliation, surrounded by beautiful people in beautiful clothes, laughing at her poverty, her scandal, her audacity in believing she belonged among them. This was the moment where she could break, could give them the tears and the flight they expected, could confirm every cruel assumption about her weakness. Eleanor lifted her chin, looked directly at Vivian, and smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had survived worse than this, who had buried a father in disgrace, lost a home, watched servants weep as they were dismissed, sold everything but a mother's pearls, and still managed to wake each morning and face a world that had decided she was worthless. "Accidents happen, Lady Vivian," Eleanor said quietly. "I'm sure you didn't mean it." The mockery in that simple phrase was so subtle that only Vivian caught it. And for just an instant, her perfect composure cracked, replaced by pure rage that someone so far beneath her would dare to have the last word. Eleanor turned toward the exit. Every eye in the ballroom followed her. Wine-stained, humiliated, defeated. She had one foot on the first marble step leading out of the ballroom when a voice rang out across the entire space. "Miss Eleanor Ashford." The voice was male, cultured, carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Eleanor froze. Behind her, the ballroom had gone silent. Even the string quartet had stopped mid-note, the last violin hanging in the air like a question. She didn't turn around, couldn't bear to see what fresh humiliation awaited. Perhaps the palace guards were being summoned to remove her. Perhaps Vivian's humiliation hadn't been enough. Perhaps— "Please," the voice said, softer now, but still carrying across the silent ballroom. "Don't leave." That voice. She knew that voice. Slowly, Eleanor turned. The crowd had parted without realizing it, creating a clear path across the ballroom floor. And at the end of that path, standing in the exact center of the marble expanse beneath the largest chandelier, was Prince Alexander. He had descended from the gallery, left his mother, walked past Lady Vivian without so much as a glance. And now he was looking directly at Eleanor with those steel-blue eyes that she'd seen only once before, 3 years ago on a dusty road, when he'd been a kind stranger in simple clothes helping her lift a heavy trunk back into her carriage after it had fallen. "The soldier," she whispered. The words barely made it past her lips, but somehow he heard them, saw the recognition dawn in her amber eyes. 3 years ago. Alexander said, his voice clear and steady, pitched to carry across the ballroom but somehow feeling intimate, as if he were speaking only to her. On a country road not far from here, my horse was injured. I was dressed as a common soldier, a disguise I sometimes use to escape the weight of the crown for a few precious days. A young woman stopped her carriage to help. She didn't know I was a prince. She had no reason to show me kindness. But she knelt in the dust and bandaged my horse's leg, with strips torn from her own petticoat. She shared her lunch with me. We talked for hours. Eleanor's heart was hammering so hard, she thought everyone must hear it. The ballroom was holding its breath. She told me, Alexander continued, walking slowly toward her now, each step deliberate, that a person's worth isn't found in their station or their title. It's found in how they treat those who can offer them nothing in return. He stopped 3 paces from her, close enough that she could see the small scar through his left eyebrow, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, close enough that she could see the absolute certainty in his eyes. "I searched for you," he said quietly. "For 3 years. I knew your face, your voice, your kindness, but I didn't know your name or where to find you. And tonight, when I saw you standing in this ballroom, enduring cruelty with the same dignity you showed that day, I knew. I knew you were the woman I'd been searching for." Behind him, 800 aristocrats stood frozen. The Duchess Margaret had her hand pressed to her chest, her face white with shock and rising horror. Lady Vivian's porcelain perfection had cracked completely, her ice-blue eyes wide, her crimson-painted lips parted in disbelief. Alexander raised his hand. "Stop the music." The command was soft, but the orchestra obeyed instantly. The silence that fell was absolute. Even the candles seemed to flicker more quietly. And then, before every noble family in England, before his mother and his future subjects, before the woman who had been chosen for him, and the woman who had humiliated the one he chose, Prince Alexander Charles Thornwick knelt on the cold marble floor. The Duchess gasped, "Alexander, no!" He didn't look away from Eleanor. "Eleanor Ashford," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion now, the princely composure cracking to reveal the man beneath. "You are the worthiest person in this room. You have faced cruelty with grace, poverty with dignity, and loss with a strength that makes you more royal than anyone wearing a crown. You taught me what true nobility means. Not blood, not titles, but character, integrity, the courage to be kind when the world has been cruel to you." He reached into his military coat and withdrew a small box, opened it. Inside was a ring, not the elaborate royal engagement ring locked in the palace vault, thick with diamonds and history. This was a simple gold band, set with a single small sapphire, the deep blue of a twilight sky. "I kneel before you not as a prince commanding a subject," Alexander said, his steel blue eyes never leaving her face. "I kneel as a man who has loved you since the moment you looked at me, and saw a person, not a title. As someone who has spent 3 years remembering the way you laughed at my terrible poetry and shared your last apple without hesitation. As someone who wants to spend the rest of his life becoming worthy of the kindness you showed a stranger on a dusty road." Eleanor's vision blurred. Tears, held back for so long through so much, finally began to fall, sliding down her cheeks and mingling with the wine stains on her gown. "I ask you before all these witnesses," Alexander continued, "before a society that has wronged you, before a kingdom that doesn't yet deserve you, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my queen?" The ballroom erupted. The Duchess made a sound like a wounded animal. Lady Vivian threw her fan at the nearest mirror with such force that it shattered, the crash of breaking glass cutting through the chaos. Half the assembled aristocrats began shouting in outrage. The other half began to clap, tentatively at first, then growing louder, overwhelmed by the sheer audacity and romance of what they were witnessing. But Eleanor heard none of it. She looked at Alexander, still kneeling, still waiting, vulnerable in a way princes were never supposed to be. She looked at the simple sapphire ring, chosen for her, not for political alliance or royal tradition. She looked at his eyes, those same kind eyes that had helped her with her trunk, that had listened to her talk about books and justice, and the unfairness of a world that valued birth over virtue. If she said yes, society would destroy her. They'd call her a social climber, a manipulator, a woman who trapped a prince. They'd dissect every word she spoke, every gesture she made, searching for proof that she was unworthy. His mother would hate her. Vivienne would make it her life's mission to ruin her. The entire aristocracy would unite against this threat to their carefully maintained hierarchy. If she said no, she would never forgive herself. She would spend the rest of her life wondering what could have been. She would grow old knowing that she'd rejected genuine love because she was afraid of society's judgment. The same society that had already judged her guilty simply for being born to a man who made bad investments and worse decisions. If you're enjoying these stories of love defying society's cruelest judgments, please subscribe to help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Your support means we can bring you more tales of courage, passion, and the triumph of genuine love over empty status. Now let's step into that candle-lit ballroom and witness the moment everything changed. Eleanor looked down at her wine-stained gown, at the mended seams her own hands had sewn by candlelight, at the worn gloves she'd darned a dozen times. She'd already survived the worst society could do to her. She'd already lost everything except her self-respect, her dignity, her ability to choose her own path. She extended her hand, trembling but steady. Yes. The word was barely audible over the chaos, but Alexander heard it, saw it in her eyes, in the way her fingers reached for his. He took her hand gently, as if she were made of spun glass and morning light, and slid the sapphire ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He'd had it commissioned 3 months ago based on memory alone, hoping against hope he'd find her again. Then he stood, still holding her hand, and faced the ballroom. She said yes. The clapping grew louder. But so did the outrage. "This is madness," someone shouted. "The prince has lost his mind. That fortune-hunting, she's nobody." But Alexander raised his free hand, and somehow, impossibly, the noise began to die down. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of royal command that had been bred into him since birth. "Eleanor Ashford is not nobody. She is the woman who showed me that kindness is a choice, made daily, in the face of a world that would rather we be cruel. She is braver than anyone in this room, because she has survived loss and humiliation and still maintained her integrity. If that doesn't make her worthy of a crown, then crowns are worthless." He turned to Eleanor, and his voice softened. "Would you honor me with this dance?" She looked at him, then at her wine-stained gown, then back at him. "I'm hardly dressed for—" "You're perfect." Alexander nodded to the orchestra. The musicians, still in shock, fumbled for their instruments. After a moment, the sweet strains of a waltz filled the ballroom. Alexander led Eleanor to the center of the floor, to the exact spot where he'd knelt. He placed one hand at her waist, took her other hand in his, and began to move. For the first few steps, they danced alone. 800 people watched in stunned silence as the Crown Prince of England waltzed with a woman in a wine-stained gown, a woman who 3 minutes ago had been the object of ridicule, a woman who now wore a sapphire ring and a smile that transformed her entire face. Then slowly other couples began to join them. Not everyone, at least a third of the ballroom, remained along the walls, whispering furiously, scandalized. But enough. Enough that the marble floor filled with swirling colors, enough that the ballroom began to feel like a celebration rather than an execution. Lady Vivienne was not among the dancers. She stood frozen near the shattered mirror, her crimson gown no longer the most striking thing in the room, her beauty somehow diminished by the rage twisting her features. She watched Alexander and Eleanor dance, watched the easy way they moved together, the way they looked at each other as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. And she began to plan. In the gallery above, Duchess Margaret gripped the balustrade with white-knuckled hands. "This cannot stand," she said to the Duke of Wellington, who stood beside her. "The king must be informed immediately." "The king is dying, Your Grace," Wellington replied quietly. "And I suspect he has more important concerns than his son's choice of bride. His choice of, she's a penniless nobody, a scandal. This will destroy the monarchy." "Or perhaps," Wellington said, watching the couple below with something that might have been approval, "it will remind the people that their royals are human, that they can fall in love like anyone else, that they can choose courage over convenience." The Duchess shot him a look that could have frozen fire. You're a soldier. You're supposed to understand duty. I understand duty perfectly, Your Grace. I also understand that a man who cannot follow his heart when it matters most will never have the courage to lead a nation when it matters even more. On the dance floor, oblivious to the political machinations already beginning to swirl around them, Eleanor and Alexander danced. "I can't believe this is real," Eleanor whispered. "In an hour, I was the most humiliated woman in London. Now I'm engaged to a prince who's been in love with you for 3 years," Alexander finished. "Though I suspect the next few hours won't be quite so romantic. My mother is probably drafting my disinheritance papers as we speak." Eleanor missed a step. Alexander steadied her, his hand firm at her waist. "She can do that? She can try. Technically, only my father the king can disinherit me, and he's not well. The physicians say weeks, perhaps days. Which means my mother is currently the most powerful person in the palace." Fear flickered across Eleanor's face. "Alexander, I cannot let you lose your crown for me. That's not—" "Stop!" He pulled her closer, so close it was almost scandalous even in a waltz. "Eleanor, I have spent my entire life preparing to be king. I know every treaty, every alliance, every political nuance that keeps this kingdom functioning. I can recite the lineage of every noble house, speak 5 languages, command armies, and negotiate with foreign powers. I know my duty." He looked into her amber eyes, and she saw the absolute certainty there. "But until 3 years ago, I didn't know what it meant to be human, to connect with someone beyond politics and duty and the weight of expectation. You gave me that. You showed me that there's something more important than crowns and kingdoms. There's the choice we make about who we want to be when no one is watching, when there's nothing to gain, when kindness costs us something." The waltz was coming to an end. The music began to slow. "If I must choose between a crown and you," Alexander said softly, "I choose you, every time, without hesitation. But your people need a king who understands what it's like to lose everything and still choose kindness. A king who knows that worth isn't measured in gold or titles. A queen who has lived among them, suffered as they have, and still maintained her dignity and grace." He smiled. "They need you, Eleanor, even if they don't know it yet." The music ended. The dancers around them began to applaud, not for the orchestra, but for them. It wasn't universal. It wasn't even a majority, but it was enough to show that not everyone in that ballroom was scandalized by a prince choosing love over politics. Alexander bowed. Eleanor curtsied, the wine stain on her gown catching the candlelight, somehow transformed from a mark of humiliation to a badge of survival. "Your Highness." A royal guard stood at the edge of the dance floor, his face carefully neutral. "The Duchess requests your immediate presence in the Rose Chamber, and—" He hesitated. "The King has been informed of tonight's events. He requires your attendance within the hour." The warmth drained from Alexander's face, replaced by the cool mask of royalty. "Tell my mother I will attend her shortly, and send word to my father that I will arrive within the half-hour." The guard bowed and retreated. Alexander turned back to Eleanor, and for just a moment the mask slipped. She saw the man beneath the prince, worried, determined, afraid, but refusing to show it. "I need to face them," he said. "Both of them. This won't be pleasant. I'm coming with you." "Eleanor, they'll what? Be cruel to me, mock my poverty, question my worth?" Eleanor's laugh was bitter, but somehow still held strength. "Alexander, I've been surviving that for 3 years. I think I can manage a few more hours." He took both her hands in his. The sapphire ring gleamed between them. "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do. Because if we're going to do this, if we're really going to defy society and tradition and every expectation, we do it together. Starting now." Around them, the ball was attempting to resume some semblance of normalcy. Couples returned to dancing. Servants circulated with champagne and whispered commentary. But nothing would be normal again. Everyone in that ballroom knew they'd witnessed something that would be discussed in drawing rooms and scandal sheets for months, possibly years to come. The question was whether they'd witnessed the beginning of a great love story or the beginning of a royal catastrophe. The Rose Chamber was a misnomer. There were no roses, only portraits of disapproving ancestors and furniture upholstered in deep burgundy that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The Duchess Margaret sat in a high-backed chair that might as well have been a throne, her emerald gown spreading around her like a pool of cold judgment. She didn't rise when Alexander and Eleanor entered, didn't acknowledge Eleanor's presence at all. "Mother," Alexander said, his voice carefully controlled. I know who she is." The Duchess's steel-blue eyes, so like her son's but utterly without warmth, fixed on Eleanor with the intensity of someone examining an insect. "Leave us, Miss Ashford. This conversation is between family." "She is family," Alexander said quietly, "or she will be. Over my dead body, if necessary." The Duchess stood so quickly her chair rocked backward. "You dare?" "I dare everything, Mother, for her, because she's worth it." "She's worth nothing. Her father died in scandal, her family lost everything. She has no connections, no dowry, she has integrity." Alexander's voice was ice over steel. "She has courage. She has kindness that costs her something, and she chooses it anyway. She has everything that actually matters. What matters is the alliance with the Hartley family. What matters is securing our position with the Northern Lords. What matters is power, wealth, status." Alexander moved to stand beside Eleanor, his hand finding hers. "The same things that have made our monarchy irrelevant to anyone who isn't trying to use it for their own gain. The same things that have turned us into political chess pieces instead of human beings." The Duchess's face had gone dangerously calm. "Your father will never allow this. My father is dying, and when he's gone, the decision will be mine. No." The Duchess smiled, and it was a terrible thing. "When your father is gone, the decision will be Parliament's, and I have already sent word to the Prime Minister. An emergency session will be called. You will be given a choice, Alexander. Renounce this person and accept your rightful role as Crown Prince and future King, or be removed from the line of succession entirely. Your brother Henry will make a perfectly adequate heir." Eleanor felt Alexander's hand tighten on hers. She'd met Henry briefly at a garden party 2 years ago, a younger, more pliable version of Alexander, easily influenced and utterly devoted to their mother. "You would destroy me," Alexander said slowly, "to maintain control. I would save you from destroying yourself for a woman you barely know. I know her better than I've ever known anyone, because she doesn't want anything from me except honesty. She doesn't see a crown or a kingdom or a political alliance. She sees me." "How romantic." The Duchess's voice dripped scorn. "And how utterly naive. Love doesn't govern kingdoms, Alexander. Power does. Strategy does. And you're throwing away every advantage you have for a girl in a wine-stained dress who will make you a laughingstock." Eleanor had been silent through all of this, standing beside Alexander, feeling increasingly like an intruder in a family conflict that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with her. But at those words, something inside her shifted. She'd been called worthless before. She'd been mocked, pitied, dismissed. She'd endured it with quiet dignity because fighting back seemed pointless. She had no power, no platform, no way to make her voice heard. But she wasn't powerless anymore. She was standing in a palace, wearing a prince's ring, being discussed as if she weren't in the room. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but clear. The Duchess turned to her, eyebrows raised in surprise that the girl had dared to speak. "I understand your concerns," Eleanor continued. "I understand that I am not what you wanted for your son. I bring no political alliances, no wealth, no powerful family connections. My father died in scandal. My family lost everything. By every measure you value, I am utterly unsuitable." She took a breath, feeling Alexander's hand steady in hers. "But I need you to understand something. I didn't seek this. I didn't come to that ball hoping to catch a prince. I came because refusing would have been a greater insult than attending. I expected mockery. I expected humiliation. I expected to spend a few miserable hours and then leave and never think about it again." Eleanor's amber eyes met the Duchess's steel-blue gaze without flinching. "And then your son knelt before me in front of 800 people and offered me not just his hand, but his heart. He told me he'd been searching for me for 3 years. He put a ring on my finger and danced with me, while half the ballroom shouted that he was mad. She felt tears threatening again, but refused to let them fall. I know I don't deserve him. Not by your standards, maybe not by any standards, but I love him. Not because he's a prince. I loved him before I knew who he was, when he was just a kind stranger helping with an injured horse. I love him because he sees worth in people that everyone else dismisses. Because he could have anyone in this kingdom, and he chose someone who has nothing. Eleanor's voice grew stronger. So, if you want to have him disinherited, if you want to remove him from succession, if you want to turn Parliament against him, I understand. But know this, if you make him choose between the crown and me, he's already told me what he'll choose. And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure he never regrets it. I'll stand beside him whether he's a prince or a pauper. I'll love him whether he has a palace or a cottage. And I'll prove to everyone who doubts me, including you, that worth isn't measured in gold or titles, but in how we treat each other when we have nothing left to gain. The silence that followed was profound. The Duchess stared at Eleanor as if seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, not the wine-stained gown or the mended gloves or the scandal-tainted family name, but the woman inside all of that. The woman who had just delivered what amounted to a declaration of war, wrapped in perfect courtesy. "You're braver than I thought," the Duchess said finally, "or more foolish." "Perhaps both," Eleanor replied. The Duchess looked at her son, at the way he stood beside Eleanor, protective but not possessive, supporting but not controlling, at the certainty in his eyes that this woman, this impossible, unsuitable, completely wrong choice, was exactly right. "The king will see you within the half-hour," the Duchess said. "Both of you, and Alexander—" She paused, something flickering across her face that might have been grudging respect, or might have been resignation. "Your father has always valued courage. Let's hope his definition matches yours." The king's chambers were darker than Eleanor expected. Heavy curtains blocked most of the daylight, leaving only candlelight and the glow from a massive fireplace. The air smelled of medicine and something else, the particular scent of mortality, of a body slowly giving up its fight. King Richard V sat in a chair by the fire, wrapped in royal purple robes that had once fit his frame, but now hung loose. He'd been a powerful man once, tall, broad-shouldered, commanding. Age and illness had winnowed him down to something more fragile, but his eyes, the same steel blue as his son's, still held sharp intelligence. "So," he said as Alexander and Eleanor entered and knelt before him, "this is the girl. This is Eleanor Ashford, father, my betrothed." The king studied Eleanor for a long moment. She kept her eyes downcast, as protocol demanded, but could feel the weight of his gaze. "Look at me, girl." Eleanor raised her eyes. "3 years ago," the king said, "my son disappeared for 2 days, gave his guards the slip, took common clothes, and vanished into the countryside. We were frantic. Thought he'd been kidnapped, killed. He came back sunburned and smiling, talking about remembering what it's like to be human. I thought he'd lost his mind." The king shifted in his chair, wincing slightly at the movement. "He's been different since then, more thoughtful, more present. Less like a perfect prince performing his role, and more like a man who has something to fight for beyond duty." He looked at Alexander. "That was you, I presume." "The girl who made my son remember he's human." Eleanor swallowed hard. "Your Majesty, I didn't mean to what? Be kind? Show compassion? Treat a stranger with dignity?" The king laughed, a sound that turned into a wet cough. When he recovered, he waved away the concerned physician hovering nearby. "Those are hardly crimes, girl." "But, Your Majesty, I don't have... My family is dead or disgraced." "Yes, I know. Your father made spectacularly bad investments and even worse decisions. He destroyed his own legacy and left you with nothing but debt and scandal." The king's eyes were sharp, despite his failing body. "None of which is your fault." He leaned forward slightly. "But here's what I want to know, Miss Ashford. If I refuse this marriage, if I order my son to marry Lady Vivian or some other suitable political match, what will you do?" Eleanor's heart hammered. This was it. The test. Say the wrong thing, and she'd destroy Alexander's future. I would let him go, she said quietly, because I love him enough to want what's best for him, even if that means breaking my own heart. Wrong answer, the king said. Eleanor's eyes widened. If you truly loved my son, the king continued, you would fight for him. Fight for your right to be together. Fight against a world that says love doesn't matter as much as political alliances and strategic marriages. Fight against me if necessary. He smiled, and for just a moment Eleanor saw where Alexander got his kindness. Let me tell me about my marriage, Miss Ashford. 40 years ago, I married a duchess chosen by Parliament. Beautiful, well-connected, politically astute. Everything a queen should be. We had 3 children together. We maintained a perfectly civil relationship. And I spent 40 years wishing I'd had the courage to marry the merchant's daughter I met at a market when I was 17. A girl with red hair and a laugh like music who told me that princes were just people with better tailors. The king's eyes grew distant. I let duty win. Let politics and strategy and the weight of expectations crush the one thing that made me feel alive. I became a good king, Miss Ashford, but I was never a happy man. And happiness, real, genuine joy in another person, is rarer than you think. Rarer than kingdoms, rarer than crowns. He turned to Alexander. I'm dying, son. The physicians are kind enough not to say it directly, but I know. Weeks, maybe days. And when I'm gone, you'll be king. You'll face impossible choices, political pressures, threats from enemies, both foreign and domestic. You'll need strength I don't think you realize you'll need. The king reached out a trembling hand toward Eleanor. Will you give him that strength, girl? Will you stand beside him when the crown is heavy and the kingdom is demanding, and everyone is telling him he made the wrong choice? Eleanor took the king's hand. It was cold, the skin paper-thin over prominent bones. I will stand beside him in every storm, she said firmly. I will remind him why he chose love over convenience. I will be his counsel when he needs wisdom, his comfort when he needs rest, and his fiercest defender when the world tries to break him. I will be worthy of him, Your Majesty, not because of my birth or my family name, but because I choose to be, every single day. The king held her gaze for a long moment, then he smiled. A real smile, the kind that transformed his whole face despite the ravages of illness. Alexander, he said, releasing Eleanor's hand, you have my blessing. Marry her. Make her your queen, and maybe, just maybe, the two of you will show this kingdom what it's forgotten, that power without love is empty, and duty without heart is tyranny. Alexander knelt beside his father's chair, emotion raw on his face. Father, don't thank me yet. Your mother is already working against you. Parliament will oppose this. Half the nobility will treat it as an insult. You'll face threats, political maneuvering, possibly even attempts at sabotage. The king's voice grew stronger, touched with the command that had ruled a kingdom for 40 years. But if you face those challenges together, if you remember that your strength comes from choosing each other above all else, you'll build something stronger than any political alliance. He placed a hand on Alexander's head, a benediction and a farewell. Rule with wisdom, my son, but more importantly, rule with love. That's the kingdom I wish I'd built. 3 hours later, as dawn began to paint the London sky in shades of rose and gold, Eleanor and Alexander stood on a palace balcony overlooking the city. The ball had ended. The guests had departed, some supportive, many scandalized, all gossip-laden. The palace was quiet except for distant sounds of servants cleaning up the aftermath of a night that would be discussed for years. Eleanor still wore the wine-stained gown. Alexander still wore his military dress uniform. Between them hung the knowledge that the real challenges were yet to come. Your mother will fight this, Eleanor said quietly, every step of the way. I know. Parliament will make demands, conditions. They might even try to revoke your inheritance if you don't meet them. I know. Society will be cruel. They'll dissect everything I say, everything I do. They'll call me a fortune hunter, a manipulator, unworthy. I know. Alexander turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I know all of it, Eleanor. I know what we're facing. And I also know that 3 years ago I met a woman who taught me that the most important choices we make are the ones that cost us something. That kindness matters, that integrity matters, that loving someone is worth any price the world demands." He lifted her hand, the one wearing his ring, and kissed it gently. "I could have chosen Lady Vivian. It would have been easy, politically advantageous, expected. I could have had a marriage like my father's, perfectly functional, strategically sound, emotionally empty, and I would have spent the rest of my life wondering what could have been if I'd had the courage to choose differently." Eleanor felt tears on her cheeks again. "Alexander, I'm terrified." "Good, so am I." He smiled. "But we're terrified together, and that makes all the difference." Below them, the city was beginning to wake. Market carts rattled over cobblestones. Chimney smoke began to rise into the dawn air. London, oblivious to the palace drama, continued its daily existence. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked. Now we face Parliament. We navigate political opposition. We plan a wedding that will either unite the kingdom or tear it apart. We prove to everyone who doubts us that love isn't a weakness. It's the strongest foundation we could possibly build on." He pulled her closer, and for a moment they were simply two people watching dawn break over a city that would never quite see them the same way again. "Everyone laughed at you last night," Alexander said softly. "When Vivian spilled that wine, when Lord Ashton made his cruel joke, when you stood in that ballroom wearing poverty like it was a badge of shame." Eleanor nodded, remembering the laughter, the mockery, the certainty that she would leave humiliated and forgotten. "They won't laugh anymore," Alexander continued. "Not when they see what we build together. Not when they realize that you, this woman they dismissed as worthless, will be their queen. Not when they learn that real nobility has nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier." He turned her to face him fully, his hands framing her face, his steel blue eyes reflecting the dawn light. "I love you, Eleanor Ashford. I loved you when you were kneeling in the dust bandaging my horse. I loved you when you were standing alone in that ballroom enduring cruelty. I loved you when you said yes, even though saying yes might destroy us both. And I will love you when you're wearing a crown, standing beside me, showing this kingdom what it really means to be royal." Eleanor kissed him as the sun rose over London, as the palace began to stir with servants and scandal, as somewhere in the city the printing presses were already preparing to spread the news that would shock England. The Crown Prince had chosen a nobody, a scandal-touched girl in a mended dress, a woman who brought nothing to the marriage except herself, and somehow inexplicably, that had been exactly enough. 6 months later. Westminster Abbey had never held such a crowd. Every pew was packed, not just with nobility, though they were certainly present, but with common people, merchants, soldiers, servants, people who had heard the story of the prince who chose love over a crown and the girl who chose courage over safety, and who wanted to witness the impossible made real. Eleanor stood in the antechamber, looking at herself in the mirror. Her wedding gown was ivory and gold, not the ostentatious creation Lady Vivian would have worn, dripping with diamonds and excess, but something simpler, elegant, beautiful in its own right. The bodice was embroidered with gold thread in a pattern of intertwined roses and vines. The skirt fell in soft folds of silk that whispered when she moved. Her dark chestnut hair was arranged in an elaborate updo, crowned with a small diamond tiara that had belonged to Alexander's grandmother, a woman who, according to family legend, had also married for love, despite opposition. And on her finger, alongside the elaborate wedding band she would receive today, was the simple sapphire ring Alexander had given her 6 months ago in a ballroom that had witnessed both her humiliation and her triumph. "You look beautiful," said a voice behind her. Eleanor turned to find the Duchess Margaret standing in the doorway. The older woman had made her opposition clear over the past 6 months, had fought against the wedding at every turn, had made Eleanor's life a study in subtle cruelty and public disdain. They were not friends, probably never would be. But something had shifted in the past month, ever since the king's death. ever since Alexander had ascended to become king in truth, not just in title. Ever since the people had rallied behind their young king and his brave queen-to-be, showing that sometimes the public had better sense than the aristocracy. "Thank you, Your Grace," Eleanor said carefully. The Duchess approached, studying Eleanor with those sharp steel blue eyes. "I was wrong about you." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Not completely wrong," the Duchess continued. "You are politically inexperienced. You do lack the training that years of preparation would have provided. You will make mistakes," she paused, "but you have something I didn't expect, integrity, real bone-deep integrity. You could have used Alexander's love to gain power, influence, wealth. Instead, you've spent 6 months learning everything you can about governing, about the kingdom, about the people you'll serve. You've visited hospitals and schools and factories. You've spoken to people I've never even acknowledged existed." The Duchess's face softened almost imperceptibly. "My son loves you. Truly loves you in a way I didn't think royalty could afford. And more importantly, you love him the same way. You make him better, stronger, more human." She reached out and adjusted Eleanor's tiara slightly. "I still think you were the wrong choice, but I'm beginning to believe you might be the right person." Eleanor felt tears threatening to ruin the cosmetics carefully applied by palace servants. "Your Grace, don't make me regret saying this," the Duchess interrupted. "And don't make me cry. I have a reputation to maintain." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Eleanor, be happy, both of you. Show this kingdom what it's forgotten, that love matters, that choosing each other matters, that being human matters more than being perfect." Then she was gone, leaving Eleanor staring after her, tears now flowing freely. The organ began to play. Eleanor walked down the aisle of Westminster Abbey on trembling legs. Every eye was on her, thousands of people craning to see the woman who had captured their young king's heart. She saw familiar faces, the servants from the palace who had welcomed her despite her lowly origins, soldiers who had served under Alexander and approved of his choice, common people who had written letters of support when Parliament tried to block the marriage, and there, in a pew near the back, her face twisted with barely suppressed rage, was Lady Vivian Hartley. She wore black, supposedly in mourning for the late king, but Eleanor knew better. Vivian was mourning her own lost future, the crown that should have been hers, the position she'd cultivated for years, only to see it given to a nobody in a wine-stained dress. Their eyes met for just an instant. Eleanor didn't smile, didn't gloat. Simply looked at her with something that might have been pity, because Vivian would never understand that love was worth more than crowns, that being chosen for who you are was more valuable than being chosen for what you bring. Then Eleanor's gaze moved forward, and there was Alexander. King Alexander now, crowned just 3 weeks ago in a ceremony Eleanor had watched from the gallery, her heart bursting with pride and terror in equal measure. He stood at the altar in formal royal robes of deep navy and gold, a crown resting on his dark hair. His steel blue eyes locked on her with such love and certainty that the rest of the abbey seemed to fade away. She reached him. He extended his hand. She took it. The Archbishop began the ceremony in Latin, then English, his voice echoing through the Gothic arches. But Eleanor barely heard the words. She was focused on Alexander, on the way his hand trembled slightly in hers, on the smile that played at the corners of his mouth, on the moment when he slid the wedding band onto her finger and whispered, "I love you," so quietly only she could hear. And then the Archbishop was pronouncing them husband and wife, king and queen, partners in all things. Alexander kissed her, and the abbey erupted in cheers, not the polite applause of aristocracy, but the genuine joy of people who had watched an impossible love story unfold and wanted desperately to believe it could last. They walked back down the aisle together, husband and wife, king and queen, hand in hand. Through the abbey doors and out into the London sunshine, where thousands more people had gathered, where the streets were packed with citizens who wanted to see their new king and the woman who had won his heart. The coronation ball that night was held in the same ballroom where Eleanor had been humiliated 6 months before. But everything was different now. She entered on Alexander's arm, wearing a gown of ivory and gold, that made her look like she'd been born to wear a crown. The same chandeliers cast the same golden candlelight, but now it felt warm, welcoming. The same marble floor reflected the same images, but now Eleanor saw a queen reflected back at her, not because of her title, but because she'd earned the right to be there. Lady Vivian was present, by requirement of social obligation. She stood near the refreshment table in a gown of deep crimson, beautiful and bitter. Eleanor approached her while Alexander was engaged in conversation with the Prime Minister. "Lady Vivian," Eleanor said quietly. Vivian's ice-blue eyes were sharp as cut glass. "Your Majesty," she replied, the title dripping with sarcasm. "I wanted to thank you." Vivian's perfect composure cracked. "Thank me for spilling that wine, for forcing me to face my worst humiliation in the most public way possible." Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. "Because if you hadn't pushed me to my absolute lowest point, I never would have discovered how strong I actually am, and Alexander never would have had the chance to show everyone what real nobility looks like." Eleanor leaned closer. "You tried to destroy me, Vivian. Instead, you revealed who I really was and who he really was. So yes, thank you." She walked away, leaving Vivian speechless for perhaps the first time in her life. Alexander was waiting for her at the center of the ballroom, the exact spot where he'd knelt 6 months ago. The orchestra began to play, the same waltz. "Shall we?" he asked, extending his hand. Eleanor took it, and they began to dance. Around them the ballroom filled with couples, but this time there was no division between those who supported them and those who didn't. There was only the shared recognition that they were witnessing something rare, a love that had survived opposition, a choice that had cost them everything and gained them even more. As they danced, Alexander whispered in her ear, "Do you remember what you told me that day on the country road, when I asked if you believed in fate?" Eleanor smiled. "I said that fate was just a pretty word for the choices we make when we have the courage to follow our hearts. You were right." He pulled her closer. "I chose you, Eleanor, not because fate demanded it, but because you showed me what it means to love someone for who they are rather than what they represent. And I would choose you again, every single time." The music swelled, the candles flickered. And in that ballroom where Eleanor Ashford had once stood drenched in wine and humiliation, where society had laughed at her poverty and mocked her audacity in appearing among her betters, she now danced as queen, loved and chosen and worthy, proving that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is refusing to let cruelty define your worth. As the dance ended, Alexander led her to the balcony overlooking London. Dawn was breaking again, a mirror of that first dawn 6 months ago when they'd stood in this same place, terrified but determined. "Everyone laughed at you," Alexander said, echoing his words from that morning. "When you stood in that ballroom, wine-stained and humiliated, they laughed, they mocked, they judged." He turned her to face the city, the thousands of people still gathered outside the palace gates, celebrating their king and queen. "They're not laughing anymore." Eleanor leaned against him, watching the sun rise over a kingdom that had learned, slowly, painfully, but ultimately truly, that worth wasn't measured in gold or titles or perfect bloodlines. It was measured in kindness, chosen daily, in courage, found in impossible moments, in love that costs everything and is worth infinitely more. In a city that had witnessed her worst humiliation, Eleanor Ashford, now Queen Eleanor, had found her greatest triumph, not because she married a king, but because she had the courage to be herself, to choose love over safety, to stand beside someone who saw her worth when the entire world insisted she had none. And in doing so, she had shown them all what it truly meant to be royal.